Anyway, I hope that I can say some things today that will be of value to you who are aspiring entrepreneurs. I have learned some lessons, and let me just begin by telling you a brief history about me, because I think that's the only way you can understand what I have to kind of pass on to you. I've had a varied career, as you heard earlier. I have had the opportunity to teach for a short while. I was a professor at USC for a couple of years, and then taught as an adjunct faculty member at Stanford Business School for several years. I am currently in the process of building yet one more company. So I'm not finished with my entrepreneurial endeavors. I have been involved over the past, in my lifetime, with 3 different startup organizations. And I would deem 2 of them to have been, to be, quite successful, and one that was not. And I think that that does give me an interesting perspective. And I think sometimes you learn the most important lessons from your failures, not always your successes. As you can see by my white hair, I'm not a spring chicken, but I turned 81 years of age last week, actually. And just so you'll know and can put me into some perspective, I have no intention to retire. And so, unlike some aspiring entrepreneurs who want to make a whole bunch of money and retire at age 35 and go clip coupons and live on Tahiti, that doesn't sound fun at all to me. And so I really enjoy what I'm doing now. And as Lee Iacocca, the former chairman of Chrysler, said, I flunked retirement. And so that gives you a little bit of perspective on kind of who I am, what I am doing. Let me tell you about the 3 organizations that I've been involved in terms of startup entrepreneurial activities. Going back to 1977, myself and a colleague who had been working for a large pharmaceutical company in Palo Alto decided to leave and start a little boutique management and organization development firm that would serve small and medium-sized businesses in the Bay Area of California. That's a great idea, isn't it? Is that a good idea? That's a great plan? It didn't work. And I think I learned a lot from that, and I'll talk with you about that. But it changed, it morphed into a very successful company. And we were acquired by the Times Mirror organization, the parent company of the Los Angeles Times. And I went on to serve as a corporate VP of Times Mirror for a number of years. I then was invited by a group of people back in Boston who had been very involved in doing industry consolidations to participate in the consolidation of the training industry. And so we merged together some 21 companies to create a kind of a publicly traded organization, went through a very exciting IPO process, and I'm happy to talk with you about that. It ultimately fell on very difficult times, had to kind of divest itself of a number of its companies, and is no longer in existence. After that, I decided to, in 2004, to start a new company. And so the firm I'm now with, we began at that time, and I would say that it's been the jury obviously is still out, but we've grown about 20% a year. It is flourishing, has a great reputation, we think, in the industry. And so I've had sort of what I would deem to be one resounding success, one, I think, success in the making, and one that didn't work out all that well, and I will be happy to discuss with you kind of what that means. Maybe it would be helpful to you just to understand a little bit about me and about what I've done, just a word or two about this industry. So the industry is kind of as follows. The learning and development industry is a very highly fragmented industry. That is, there are probably hundreds of companies. No one company has more than 1 or 2% of the entire market. Hard to know what the market is exactly, but at least kind of $70 billion in annual revenues. It is a non-capital intensive business, so anybody with a Macintosh computer and a good idea can sort of declare himself or herself to be in the training business and to go out and market their brand new idea about how to make managers better. And finally, it is a reasonably high profit margin arena, so it's attractive and people are coming in constantly. And one of the big challenges then is to rise above the amazing clutter that exists in such a fragmented industry. So with that being said, just a word or two about what I've done and the industry. Let me just stop for a second and see if you've got any questions about those two things. You know, what I've done and what the industry is. Any questions? You need to go quick if you have a question. Okay, well then, having said that then, let me just talk about some lessons that I've learned. The first one is that I think there's enormous value in preparation. So I mentioned to you that I had worked for 11 years as the vice president of human resources for a pharmaceutical company. And I believe that corporate work experience was very valuable for my entrepreneurial days later on. It gave me credibility. It gave me understanding of what clients want who are buying the kind of products that I would ultimately then work to produce. If anything, in hindsight, I wish I had had some experience working for companies that were external suppliers who were doing the same kinds of things that I'm doing now. I think I would have learned some very valuable lessons. And so I can't say enough about the value of, so if you don't leave school and immediately begin your highly successful startup company, but you decide to work for a few years, that isn't a bad decision. To get good experience, to get the perspective from an internal operation that serves client companies. The second lesson I'd like to talk with you about has to do with the need for differentiation. It happens that I have a son that teaches business strategy at Washington University. And Todd is a very thoughtful and I think well-published scholar in the field of strategy. And I think one of his real contributions has been this notion that the market pays a premium for a company that's differentiated, and companies succeed when they're differentiated. And so as I think back to the 3 ventures I've been involved in, what differentiated Zenger Miller was that at the time it got launched, most management, supervisory, middle management training consisted of often professors coming in and giving lectures on things like planning, organizing, staffing, directing, and controlling. And how much behavior change comes about from hearing lectures on things like that. And if you're thinking to yourself, none, I think that's pretty close. So back in the year when we started our product phase of this business, there had been some pioneering work done at General Electric, J.C. Penney, American Telephone and Telegraph, who had been just dabbling with an idea that was totally different in terms of training supervisors. And the idea was, rather than giving them a bunch of theory, show them a video of a supervisor or a manager handling a difficult situation really well. Tell them what it was that he or she did that made that a good example. And then have your training time spent in people rehearsing or practicing that skill applied to a real situation that they have back home. So it was that bridge between theory and practice, that bridge between just hearing about something and doing it. And that doesn't sound all that revolutionary to you probably right now. But in the year 1965, that was a very revolutionary idea. We built the company on that idea. There were 1 or 2 other firms that had also dabbled in that. but we thought that they did it very rigidly. They did it without being really flexible and very customer responsive. We thought we could do it better than they were doing it. And that, I believe, was the key to the success of Zenger Miller. Now, what was distinguishing about Provant, or what was thought to be distinguishing about it, was that it would be the largest training organization in the world. I recall one day going to the Ford Motor Company headquarters and meeting with a person in their purchasing department, and I said to her, "So how many companies, how many firms do you do business with?" And she said, "I do business with 582 organizations." And I said, "And how many of those are in the training and development space?" And she said, 582. And I said, "Would you like to be doing business with a smaller number of suppliers?" "Oh, yes, absolutely. We would love that." So we had all kinds of feedback from customers saying, yes, we would like to be doing business with a sole supplier or one that would cover a lot more of our bases. But in practice, that didn't really work. The amount of cross-selling, the amount of one company leading another company into that client, it didn't really happen. And so what was hoped to be the distinguishing quality of Provant never really kind of worked all that well. Now, just a word or two about the current organization I'm involved with. We've tried to distinguish ourselves by one simple fundamental concept. Most leadership development that gets practiced in organizations today consists of some mechanism or some individual who is hired to kind of meet with the executive and help him or her see what they do badly. What are their weaknesses? What gets in their way? What detracts from their performance? And so it's a very weakness-based approach. Our research, on the other hand, said the most effective leaders are not effective because they are devoid of any weakness, but it is because they possess a small number of strengths. They really are good at a few things. And they're up at the 90th percentile on 4 or 5 leadership competencies. So rather than spending all your time worrying about the things you don't do so well, you'd be far better off focusing on the things that you do quite well, things you're getting a B grade on now, and elevating that into an A grade. Now again, that may not sound revolutionary to you, but it is. And it's a very different perspective than had been practiced in this field up until now. I guess I would say the other thing that's distinguishing about what we're trying to do and how we've tried to differentiate ourselves in the marketplace is that we're much more targeted on analytics and data and what does the research say about what makes a good leader rather than what does some successful executive or what does some professor or what does some consultant believe to be the key to leadership success. So point number 2, I guess, is if you want to build a great company, find that dimension that really would differentiate it from all the other companies that will likely be in that space. Let me talk about one more. I know from my own experience that there is something very tempting about building a company, as I maybe alluded to earlier, having it be very successful, doing this at a very early age, having it grow in a meteoric kind of way, and then flip it and do an IPO or do something, have it be acquired by some large other corporation, and walk away with a lot of money in your pocket. And for those of you for whom that is your aspiration, let me just sort of paint for you what I believe is maybe the alternative. I would argue that there's something really fundamentally very satisfying about building a truly great company. And I've seen people do both, And invariably, the people I've known in the long run will tell you it was building a great company that was most rewarding. I lived for 35 years in Silicon Valley and got to know many of the early people in the valley. And I've always thought about Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard. I know that Hewlett-Packard's kind of having some difficulties right now, but they built a truly remarkable organization. Now, its origins were kind of quirky. They began by creating a device that would measure the length of time it takes a pigeon to leave the roost and come back and land back in the nest. But their point was, the product doesn't matter. It's the culture, it's the company that really matters. And so Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard unswervingly began from day one saying, how do we build a really outstanding organization? So I would say to you, I believe if I've had any success, it's because I've tried to focus on how do you build really great products that do what they purport to do, products that are better than their competitors on the market. Tried to create, kind of the high end rather than the low end kind of business model. And I would say to you that my failure came when I was involved in a company that was primarily about financial gain. That there was something about just being riveted on how much money could be made, and that the uniting quality was a strong tinge of greed, was not really very satisfying. And I'm happy to talk with you more about the 21 founders that I got to know pretty well of these organizations, and what happened to them after they sold their companies, and how happy they were after they sold these organizations. So, lesson number 3 I would submit to you is, if you're thinking about being an entrepreneur, let me encourage you to think about how do you build a long-lasting, high-quality company that, yeah, someday you may want to sell it, someday you may want to be acquired, someday you may want to go public, but in many cases you may find that it's really wonderful to be private. Lots of companies that were public decide that it's really better to be private, and they kind of buy themselves back out of being public. And so build a good company. Build a great company. The fourth lesson I would propose to you is about the need to be flexible. I mentioned to you that Zenger Miller, the first company I was involved in, got started as a company that would provide leadership development, management development to small and medium-sized companies in the Bay Area. Great idea. Wonderful idea. Problem was, small and medium-sized companies don't worry about people development. They're much more concerned about survival. And on all the order of the priorities that were facing the leaders of these companies, one of the priorities was not the career development or the leadership skills or the supervisory skills of their managers. So I was sitting one day with a client who was having this discussion about to what degree their business should be a consulting business versus being a product business. And they had this very interesting kind of debate about the virtues of products versus services and consulting. And as I sat there, boy, I'll tell you, it hit me like a ton of bricks that we were in the wrong business. That being a consulting company was not the right strategy at all. And that the far better strategy would be to develop a product or products that could do several things. It could impact not just one company or the company that you had enough time to do consulting with, but could impact hundreds of companies, potentially and thousands and tens of thousands of people. And that sounded far more appealing to me than spending my whole life working with just a handful of companies in one part of the geography. I tell you that story only because I think the key to success, and I've heard this from many other entrepreneurs, is very often the plan that you begin with is not the plan you're going to end with. And I believe one of the keys is don't get so locked into that plan that you aren't willing to sort of say, oops, made a mistake, wrong direction, we're going to kind of bag this and start something new and different. And I think that the success of most entrepreneurs would have a story like this somewhere in their history where they kind of came to the realization, we were going down the wrong path, and the key to success was being willing to divert from that. Let me just stop for a second and see if you have any questions about whatever I've said so far. Let me just see if there's anything that you'd like to ask me before we go further. Talk about more lessons. Yes, please. My best recollection, the question was, how many years were we doing consulting before we switched to being a product company? And it was about 3 years. And the problem was that not only did it involve a whole bunch of travel, and your income is totally a function of how many hours you're willing to spend and how many days you want to be on the road, but it's just also that the limited ability to make an impact. And I'm just guessing about most of you, and that is, I suspect that most of you would share with me that the feeling that I want to somehow make a dent in the world. I want to do something that's going to have lasting value. And it felt to me like the best way to do that was to move toward a product-oriented kind of business. Other questions? Yeah, up here. By a product, I mean, so it's workbooks, it's manuals, it's videotapes. It's something that somebody else can deliver. It's a product that we can train trainers inside the organization for them to deliver, rather than me going in and doing this always as as the person providing the service and giving the lecture and doing the presentation. So it's a scalability question. How do you replicate that for large numbers of people? Does that answer your question? Got it. Other questions you want to ask before I go on any further? Other about what I've said so far? Yes, please.
Were most of your businesses in partnership? I see you got Zenger Miller and
Yeah, and let me just make a comment about that. So Zenger Miller was the first company I started, and that company was acquired by Times Mirror, and the new company, they merged 2 or 3 companies together, and they dropped the name. If they hadn't dropped the name, I would never have used the name again. But the name had a great deal of value in the marketplace. People knew the name really well, so we decided to do that. The question was, were most of my organizations in partnerships? And one of the points we're coming to has to do specifically with that. Do you mind if I hold that question, or hold the answer? But in brief, the answer is, yes, they have been. This is a lonely business when you're all by yourself. And so, yes, in every case, there have been other people who were very substantial shareholders and partners with me. Okay, one more question, and then I'm going to go on. Anybody else have anything else they would like to ask about what I've talked about so far? Going once? Twice? Okay. The fifth point, I guess, I would like to make to you is, I think there's great value in building an organization around some solid, well-researched body of either data or some perspective that really does distinguish it. It doesn't need to be your own research. In none of the cases that I can think of was this totally our own. But I believe that the most successful organizations have a solid foundation on something that is really well researched. In the case of Zenger Miller, let me just mention again. So this idea that the right way to teach somebody a skill is to show them an example of somebody doing it came from research that was done by a Professor Albert Bandura at Stanford University. It was referred to as social learning theory, and it really got at the whole heart of the question about how do we as adults learn to do anything? How does a child learn to tie his or her shoes? How does a child learn how to eat or dress himself or herself? And Bandura would argue it is by them watching somebody else do it. And they watch it several times, and they learn by watching. Now that, again, sounds like a very simple idea, but it had never been applied to teaching skills in the business world. And so a very good friend of mine, a fellow named Mel Sorcher, who had been hired by General Electric, had been charged by the CEO of GE to fix their supervisors. They were operating under a consent decree from the government to hire many more minority workers. And they would hire minority workers, and they would come in the door, be there for a few weeks, and then they would leave. And there was this revolving door of people coming in and going out. And the executives were kind of going nuts because they were doing their best to comply with this consent decree, but they were not being able to be successful. They couldn't retain people of color, people from different nationalities, and they concluded it was because the supervisors just didn't know how to deal with these people. And so Sorcher was given this charge, fix the supervisors. So Sorcher, who was a part-time adjunct professor at Syracuse University, went to a faculty party one night, and he was talking to some fellow faculty members about a way to treat phobias and a way to treat people who had mild psychological disorders. And the treatment really consisted of showing them videotapes of people behaving naturally and normally and handling difficult situations well. And as Sorcher kind of drives home and is thinking about this, he says to himself, if you can help people who are a little bit troubled change their behavior and be able to function better, why can't we train supervisors the same way? And so, but it was great research. It was very solidly documented, and we knew it really worked. In the case of what we're doing now at this company I'm now associated with, we've got lots of hard data that says if you give a manager a 360-degree feedback instrument and you present the information to her in the right way, over a period of time and with some coaching and some help, you can see measurable improvements in how they behave, how they function. Solid, well-documented, well-grounded research. And so for those of you thinking about creating companies, and I realize this may not apply to every kind of company. If you're thinking about creating a new Angry Birds game or something, this may not quite apply. But I think in general, most great companies will be built on something that's really solid and well documented, quality kind of research. Provant had nothing to distinguish it from its, from an intellectual property perspective. There was just nothing that really separated it, and that was a red flag. Now I come to the question that was asked here earlier. You've all been in classes and lectures about choosing your life partner. Is that true? Everybody here had that lecture about choosing your life partner? And to do that carefully, and to do it thoughtfully, to do it after a lot of deliberation. Don't do it hastily. Think very clearly about what you want. Here at BYU, I know that there's this wonderful questionnaire that the Marriage and Family Counseling Department has created that is available for a young couple who are contemplating marriage, and it asks a whole bunch of questions of both parties. And if you put those answers together into a composite and you say, okay, so where are the matches and where are the potential disconnects, you can save a lot of marriages that are going to potentially fall on the rocks unless they decide how they're going to handle how we spend money, how we raise the kids, what we do in different situations. And now I would say to you, as you think about starting a business, I would suspect that in most cases you won't do it all by yourself. You won't be a sole proprietor. And the decision about who you choose as your partner will be every bit as important as the person you choose as your spouse. Because in some ways you'll spend more time with them, especially in those first few years. You'll spend lots of waking hours with this person. And so that they have the same long-term objectives, that they have the same values, that they have the same goals, that they have the same expectations, that they have the same perspective about compensation and their remuneration. Those are very, very key decisions and understandings that you need to have between the two of you. And so I just couldn't stress enough the importance of making that decision very, very thoughtfully. I don't know how many of you had a parent that said it's easier to get into things than it is to get out of them. Anybody ever had a parent tell you that? You've had a few of you have had that, heard that? Well, if you haven't heard that, let me mention that to you. It's a lot easier to get into things than to get out of them. And it's hard to get out of partnerships. And so be very careful about who you choose as your partner. The seventh lesson I would share with you has to do with how you attract and retain good people. If you want the people that work with you to behave like owners and not hired hands, treat them like owners. Give them stock options. Let them participate and own a piece of the rock. They operate and behave in a very different way when they are part owners rather than just being hired hands. It doesn't mean you give 25% of the stock to your first secretary. I mean, I've seen that done, and to much regret later on, obviously. But I think sharing, and I think one of the great successes of Silicon Valley has been that there was this prevailing kind of ethic that said, be generous and share ownership broadly throughout the organization, not just with 2 or 3 people, but more broadly. The 8th lesson I would just submit to you is make sure that the work that you're doing, make sure that this venture you're about to embark on really plays to your strengths. So whatever yours is, if you find a venture that really plays to that strength, then it's no longer its work. If you enjoy doing it, then it's not work. My wife kind of jokingly says, for me, work is play. And I readily acknowledge that is the case. For me, the line between work and play is very murky. And in many cases, I would enjoy doing what some people would describe as work than I would going out and playing golf or skiing or other kind of, watching a movie or doing some other things that many people find very enjoyable. It happened that my passion was in finding good research that wasn't being implemented and synthesizing that research into some logical kind of coherent way and helping people to somehow be better leaders. That sounded really fun to me, and it has always been really fun to me. And so for the past 50 years, which is about twice as long as most of you have been alive, that's what I've been doing. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. I'm very much in that mold that Steve Jobs talked about, but when you wake up in the morning and you say, if I knew that today was my last day, would I do what I'm about to go do? And if the answer is no, then you should change your mind and go do something else. And so for me, I can wake up in the morning and say, yeah, if I knew I had a week to live, this is what I would go do. I wouldn't change that. Now let me talk a little bit about exit strategies. A lot of you are familiar with the name Joseph Fielding Smith. Not long after he was selected as the president of the church, he was interviewed by a reporter who said to him, "Mr. Smith, you're a very old, an old man, and have you ever thought about retirement?" And Joseph Fielding Smith kind of looked at him and said, "Young man, I've observed that when people," I think these were his exact words, "when people announce their retirement, God takes them up on it." And I thought that was one of his more kind of important insights and doctrines, maybe. So I told you that I had the chance to work with 21 entrepreneurs who sold their businesses to this company called Provant. Now, I need to tell you that I didn't stay in touch with all 21. There were a couple of them that sort of drifted away, and I didn't really stay in touch. But let me just tell you my observations about the 18 or 19 that I did stay in touch with. After selling their business, they had quite a bit of money in their pockets, in the main. But as the years went on, I saw them really frustrated and sad and wanting to somehow regain where they had been and to kind of, if they could just kind of go back. I'm quite confident, because a number of them said this to me, that if they had to do it over again, they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't have sold their companies. That dream of kind of having a bunch of money and going off and playing, that was a very short-lived dream. I do believe that work gives meaning and purpose to life. And so I would submit to you, think very hard about the plan that says, I'm going to create this little company, I'm going to make a whole ton of money, I'm going to flip it, I'm going to sell it, and then I'm going to go off and play. And I'm saying to you, my observation of people who have done that is that the play that they engage in was not as satisfying as the work that they had been engaged in before. There's a bunch of medical evidence that you maybe be aware of that says the healthiest and happiest people are people who are doing meaningful work. And I've heard eminent physicians say, if you like the work that you're doing, far better that you continue doing it. You're going to live longer, you're going to be healthier and happier than if you stop and go off and play golf and lie on the beach or clip coupons somewhere. Let me stop at that point and see what comments you have or questions you would ask me. So I've given you some of the lessons that I've learned, some of the observations I've made about the life of an entrepreneur. So questions that you have for me while we're all together. Yes, please.
You talked about how important it is to find a partner.
Yeah.
Maybe talk about how you decided on certain partners and what characteristics made you decide on them.
Yeah, I think that there's no question that part of finding partners is a little bit like we know about the research on marriage partners, and that is that there's a high propensity or likelihood for you to marry the girl next door. So physical proximity is a big predictor of who you end up being in partners with. So it happens that when the Provant company was organized, we were in a building, and on one corner, one end of one hallway was an office, and on the other end of the other hallway was an office, and a fellow named Zenger Folkman and I had these two offices, and I knew that he had been collecting a lot of data over the years, and so I used to walk down the hall periodically and say to him, Joe, I'll bet in that whole mound of data that you have about leaders, there's probably some really interesting insights. And so I would kind of go down and tease him and kind of needle him a little bit about doing some research on this data that he had. As we talked about writing a book together and we did this project together, the book was a good first start because I could kind of see his work ethic. I could see how he functioned. And then we had some long talks about, so what kind of business do we want to have? And where do we want to go? And what's our long-term strategy? Now, I would say to you that even after having done that, does that mean that everything is sweetness and light and that we're in perfect harmony and that we always agree on things? The answer is no. But on the fundamentals, on the basics, we were very much together. And so that's, I think, the real key. So I just believe that those are it's finding people and talking through those issues about what's your long-term objective, what do you value most, why are you doing this, what's important to you. Those are the things that lead you to the right partner. Okay, a couple of other quick questions before I kind of wind up here. I think I've got about one more minute. All three of my ventures were financed very differently. The first one, it happened that my partner and I had both invested some money in a little company, paid off 25 to 1. We had a bunch of money that we could invest to make this product come alive when the 3 years taught us that we were in the wrong business. The second company, Provant, was an IPO, bank financed, Wall Street, all the road shows, tours, mutual funds, all kinds of things on the street. I didn't find that very much fun. That was not my best day. The third venture, the one I'm currently in, we started with a tiny amount of money. It had revenue from day one. It didn't require a big investment, so I'm not a good source of information about investments for you. The final thing there's two things I've been asked to comment on. One is about education. I would strongly encourage you to stay with your education, particularly maybe if you're in a business at all like the one I've been in. Both of the founders in the company I'm now in have terminal degrees. It's not necessary to be successful in this business, but I think thought leadership is an important element of stature and visibility in this industry. Not true for all industries. But I would say, again, in our case, books are great marketing devices, and I just finished the 12th book, and I'm going to start on another one because they're better brochures than any brochure you can leave behind. The last thing I want to just mention is the role of leadership that I was asked to comment on. Without question, the nature of the leaders in an organization make a profound impact on its success. We have a voluminous data that says you can predict the profitability, the customer satisfaction, the employee retention, virtually any measure of organizational success. You can correlate to the quality of leadership of an organization. And that's going to be true of your company as well. So to the degree that you can develop strong leadership capabilities and traits, you will go a long way toward ensuring your success. It's very much about assembling the right team. It's not about you personally, but it's very much about you putting together the right team. I think our time is up, and so I'll turn the time back to Dave. And